Hi everyone, so today I'll be going over question 4 on the object-oriented programming worksheet for CSM, and we'll get right into it. So question 4 tells us to implement the classes so that the following code runs. So let's take a look first at the block of code that they kind of give us, and then we'll take a look at the skeleton code so we can better understand how we can actually implement this whole class structure and system. So first of all, we can see here that we have P assigned to a plant instance. So we can assume here that there's going to be a plant class, and every plant is going to start out with a height of 1, as you can see from here. And every plant will also be instantiated with an empty materials array. So we also know that plant will have an absorb method, which we don't really know yet what it's going to do, but based on the next line, we can kind of see that because of the change in the materials list, we can kind of infer that maybe it's doing something like adding sugars, and that's kind of further confirmed when we take a look at the sugar.sugars created, which we can see that this class variable has kind of increased by 1 now. And next we can see that every plant seems to also have this leaf, which can access a variable called sugars used, and currently it's instantiated to 0. However, when we say p.grow, which is another method for the plant class, we can see that the materials has now decreased from 1 sugar to 0 sugars. However, the height of the plant has also increased to 2. And lastly, we can also see that this leaf.sugars used variable, that also increases to 1 from 0. So we can kind of infer that through grow, based on how many sugars are removed from the materials array, we know that a leaf will use those sugars in order to increase a plant's height. So kind of with all that knowledge in our kind of like minds right now, let's keep that in mind while we take a look at the skeleton code. So in the plant class, we have a constructor, and the constructor it basically instantiates our plant object. It tells us that we have a leaf, a list of sugars, and an initial height of 1. We also have this absorb method, and we also have this grow method. Moving on to the leaf and sugar classes, we can see that the leaf has a constructor that takes in a plant. It also has an absorb method, and it has a repr method. Lastly, the sugar class has a class variable called sugars created, which we saw in the doc tests. It also has a constructor that takes in a leaf and a plant. It has an activate method where we can use a sugar, and it also has a repr method. So to me, the most logical place to kind of start with is to start small, because I think the plant class actually uses a lot of methods and ideas that we'll need to implement first in the leaf and sugars classes in order to better understand how we can kind of implement those in a larger structure. So let's take a look at the sugars class first. As you can see here, we have sugars created is 0. So that's already our global variable instantiated, and we know that when we create a sugar, we actually want to increase this number. So we can do this by saying sugar.sugars created plus equals 1. So that's the first step in our constructor. And secondly, we also need to assign leaf and plant to specific variables for this instant, because every single sugar will be assigned to a different leaf and also a different plant possibly. So with that in mind, we can also do something like self.leaf equals the leaf that was passed in as a parameter. And we can also do self.plant equals the plant that was passed in as the parameter. Next, we know that we want to activate a sugar. So remember, if we take a look back at the doc test here, we know that when a sugar is activated or used, we actually have a variable called sugars used in a leaf object that changes based on how many sugars are activated. Moreover, we also know that materials, which is the plant's array, also changes based on whether or not a sugar is activated. So with these two kind of key notes in mind, we can go back to the activate method and say that, okay, well, the first thing we'll need to do is actually increase our leaf's sugars used by 1. So we can take our instances, so self.leaf, and we'll want to call the instance variable sugars underscore used, and we want to add 1 to it because we've used the sugar. Another thing we need to do is actually remove ourselves from the plant.materials list. So we can do this by saying self.plant.materials. So this is allowing us to access our plant's materials list, and we want to remove ourselves. So we can do remove self. And that's essentially all we have to do for activate. And with this sugar class kind of created and following the doc tests that were given, we can move on to the leaf class. So here we can see that in our constructor, a leaf is initially instantiated alive, and it also keeps track of how many sugars it has created. So this kind of tells us that we need two variables. The first one being a variable to keep track of whether or not the leaf is alive. So we can say something like self.alive equals true. Another thing we need to keep track of is how many sugars it has used. So we can do this by making another variable called self.sugarsused equals 0, because we start out with having 0 sugars used. And lastly, because we're also given this plant and we want every leaf instance to belong to a plant, and we want to be able to kind of attach those together and connect them in some sort of way, we can do something like self.plant is equal to the plant that was given in our constructor, similar to how we did in the sugars constructor. So now we can take a look at the absorb method. So this is telling us that if a leaf is alive, a sugar needs to be added to the plant's list of sugars. So remember how we remembered the plant that was given in the constructor through a instance variable. We can now refer back to that instance variable and say, okay, well, if we're absorbing a sugar, we want to be able to attach that to the plant's material list. So we can say self.plant.materials. This is allowing us to access the materials list of the plant that this leaf belongs to, and we want to append a new instance of sugar. So we want to append sugar, and remember the sugar constructor takes in a leaf and a plant. So we'll want to pass in ourselves as a leaf. So sorry, that should actually say self, and we'll also want to pass in self.plant, because the sugar and the leaf will belong to this larger plant that is kind of encompassing everything. And that is how we'll write this absorb method. So now we can move on to the kind of like big class that has everything inside it. So here we can see that in the plant classes constructor, a plant has a leaf and also a list of sugar it's created so far, and initial height of 1. So here we can say we want to instantiate a leaf specifically for this plant. So we can say self.leaf equals leaf self. So remember that the leaf constructor takes in a plant object, and in this case, because we want this leaf to belong to this particular plant instance, we want to pass in ourselves as the parameter for the leaf constructor in order to instantiate a leaf that belongs to this plant. We'll also want to instantiate an empty materials array called self.materials, and we'll want to instantiate this as being empty because we don't start with any sugars in it. And lastly, the comment tells us that we also needed an initial height of 1. So we can say self.height equals 1. Now we can move on to the absorb. So remember how we created an absorb method in the leaf section, and this is essentially doing appending that sugar to us, and also we can see here that it's essentially doing the job for us. So if this leaf object is already calling absorb for us to append our sugar to ourselves, we can do the same. We can do exactly what the instructions say and call the leaf to create the sugar. So we can essentially just call self.leaf.absorb to kind of like defer this action to a method in the leaf class to do it for us, because we've kind of already written a method that does exactly what the comment is telling us to do. And that's the absorb method. So now we can move on to the last method, grow. So remember that in this method to begin with, we can kind of think of what's connected to this in the rest of the class. Well, we know that what's keeping track of all the sugars inside this particular plant is the self.materials list. And every sugar, or in every slot inside that self.materials array, we have a sugar. And for each sugar object, if you recall, we wrote a method called activate. And this should be called when a sugar is used. And what the activate function does is it essentially just adds to its leaf number of sugars used, and it also removes it from the materials, which is, once again, exactly what we need to do in order to kind of make this grow happen correctly. So because we've already written the function to do that in a different class, we can just directly call that method on every single sugar object in the self.materials array. So how can we do this? Well, we want it because we need to access every single individual object inside the self.materials array. We can say for sugar in self.materials, which is accessing every single individual sugar object or instance inside the self.materials array. We can activate that sugar, which is effectively going to increase our leaf's sugar count and also remove it from our materials list. And the kind of like final step that we need to do is increase our own height by 1. So we can say self.height plus equals 1. And overall, that's how you do this question.